I'll let you tell me. Oh, yeah. Love it. Is that good, Shelley? Yep. Okay. All right. I think we are ready to start. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to this event. My name is Anna Simonson, and I'm one of the librarians here at Wagner. And this is our second Speaking of Health event. Speaking of Health, for those of you who don't know, is a public-facing health humanities discussion series generously funded by the South Dakota Humanities Council. So thank you, South Dakota Humanities Council, for your support. We are also fortunate to have wonderful support from the USD Sanford School of Medicine and Sanford's DeGroote Center for Bioethics. We have truly been fortunate this year to find brilliant, creative, caring individuals to be a part of this series, which brings me to our speaker tonight, Sam Kean. Tonight, Sam will be talking about his most recent book, The Ice Pick Surgeon, which is for sale, by the way, right outside the classroom, as well as some of his other books. I love Sam's writing for many reasons, but in The Ice Pick Surgeon, for those who haven't read it yet, Sam somehow takes numerous stories from the 17th century to the future and makes them coalesce. And he has the rare ability to make you laugh and teach you something and also completely gross you out in one page or even sometimes one sentence. But most important for the event tonight, Sam places the humans behind the science front and center and asks the always relevant question, how far is too far? In fact, Sam shows again and again that unethical science often leads to bad science. And his book is a great reminder to consider what exactly we're doing in the name of scientific and medical advancement and how we're doing it. Ultimately, Sam shows that when you compromise your morals, you don't win, although you might end up in one of Sam's books. So without further ado, Sam Kean.
Well, we're gonna hit. Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining me tonight on this very, very cold night. I'm from South Dakota, but I live in DC, so this is a bit of a shock coming back, but I'll get used to it in a few days. Thank you everyone online for joining as well. So I am going to start off with a quote by Albert Einstein. Just most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character. And I admit the first time I read this quote, it's Einstein. You have to take it very, very seriously because it's Einstein. But sort of deep down, this quote baffled me. I mean, I don't want scientists to be jerks necessarily or anything. But at the same time, I thought, discoveries, that's what really matters in science. Yeah, I hope they're kind-hearted, but discoveries, that's the most important thing in science. That's what matters. And I'm going to circle back to this quote at the end of the talk, but I wanted to start here because I've really changed my mind about what I think about this quote. And what changed my mind actually was writing this book, The Ice Pick Surgeon. I feel like I get that quote from Einstein now, having written this book. And I've never quite written a book like this. If you read my other books, they're full of sort of funny, strange, spooky stories, and there's a bit of a lighthearted feel to a lot of the stories in those books. This book is a little bit darker. It has a bit of an edge to it. It's packed full of stories about things like piracy, espionage, fraud, sabotage, grave robbing, murder, and more. And while some of the names that come up in a book about, science and stuff like this might not surprise you, people like the spies on the Manhattan Project, the Unabomber, some of the Nazi doctors doing experiments during World War II, some of the other names might surprise you a little bit. People like Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Edison, even Cleopatra. And overall, the book tries to fuse the drama of scientific discovery with the lurid thrill of a true crime tale. But there's another side to these stories as well. It's not just men and women behaving badly. It dissects science itself and tries to show why discoveries are not all that counts within science. So I'm going to start with a bit of a wild story. Now, think back to your American history class in high school, maybe college a little bit too. There was always one section about rebellions in the early American Republic. We would talk about, Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, names like that. So raise your hand if you remember a single thing about any one of those rebellions. I remember the names, okay, a little bit, but I honestly could not remember a thing about any of those rebellions. I remember nothing about them. But there is one series of rebellions, riots in early American history that I wish they had taught us about. I think they'd be much more memorable and interesting. And that is the anatomy riots that took place in the 1700s and early 1800s. The cause of these anatomy riots was fairly simple. Back then, frankly, people did not donate their bodies to science. And having your body dissected by a doctor, by an anatomist, was considered taboo. People just did not like that idea for religious and other secular reasons. But they just did not like the idea of having their own bodies dissected. But that introduced a bit of tension because doctors, of course, needed to know how the body was put together. They needed to know what organs were inside the body, how they fit together, how diseases progress, things like that. Imagine being a doctor, trying to cure somebody, trying to help with their disease, and having no idea what the organs look like, how they fit together, anything like that. That's a position a lot of doctors were in because, again, they couldn't dissect bodies and look at them. So the doctors decided they had to get a little dirty. They decided they had to start robbing graves. And you can see a picture right here. Doctors needed bodies to study, but the only way they could get them was by robbing graves. So often what they did at first is they would hire their students to do it. And sometimes the students, they would go out, they were students, they would get drunk, and they would go do this, dig up the graves, pull the bodies into the hospitals, things like that. But eventually this system evolved, this kind of black market system, where they hired professionals to do the grave robbing for them. Gangs of thieves, basically, they were working. They called these people the resurrectionists. That was kind of the nickname they had, or the sack 'em up man, they sometimes called them too. And basically what they do is they would wait for someone to die. They would wait till the moon was either down or there was no moon. And they would go out, they would dig them up, put them in a sack, toss them over their shoulder. They'd go to the doctor's office, the hospital, the clinic, whatever. They'd sort of sneak in the back door. They would knock. The doctor would come, body would go in, money would go out, and then the doctors would have a body that they could work on. And this is where the trouble started. Because as you can imagine, people were not very happy about this. Their great aunt would go missing. Their brother or sister would go missing. Sometimes their children would go missing to doctors because the doctors needed the bodies, but people were very upset, understandably upset, about graves being robbed for this purpose. And resurrectionists were actually not very popular people, if you can imagine. They got beat up a lot. There's stories of them getting whipped with wires. In one case, someone got thrown into the grave he had just opened up, and they tried to bury him in the grave that he had just taken the body out, which I think is a bit of a keen sense of irony there, but he ended up getting away. But people really did not like these resurrectionists. They were very angry about them. But in a couple of cases, things extended beyond the resurrectionists to the doctors themselves. And one case of revenge in New York would become particularly infamous. So this case started off in the dissection room. It wasn't as crowded as this one. In this case, there was a single man there, a student, who was dissecting a woman that day. A medical student just trying to dissect a woman. And he noticed that there were some street kids kind of running around, tapping on the window, peeking in, trying to see what he was doing. And, they're kids. There was a real life dead body. They'd never seen something like this. They were curious. But they started to distract him. They were yelling, tapping on the window, distracting him. He got annoyed by this. He was just trying to work, trying to become a doctor, trying to help people cure disease. So finally, the student got sick of this, and he played kind of a crass joke. He grabbed the arm of the woman he was dissecting, and he sort of waved it at them. And he said, "Yoo-hoo, this is your mother. I just dug her up," har har, to kind of drive the kids away. Unfortunately, One of the kids had just lost his mother. So he runs home to his father. He's crying. He's saying, that man, he said he got mom. And so the man, the husband, the father, grabbed a shovel, marched out to his wife's grave, and he started digging. And he dug down 6 feet. And when he got to the bottom, he found exactly what he expected. Nothing. Her body was missing. And we don't know exactly if the woman that the medical student was with was the wife and the mother. It might have been that somebody else got the body first. But regardless, her body was missing. Someone had stolen her body. So the husband father went back to his home and started talking to his neighbors. And he said, can you believe this? Can you believe this happened? And his neighbor said, well, actually, yes, we can. My great aunt went missing. My child went missing. My brother went missing. Everyone had a story. They knew someone this had happened to. And they decided that this was the end of it. They were not going to take this. So they grabbed, their pitchforks, their torches, whatever, and they marched on the hospital where the student had been. And when they arrived, the doctors did not play it cool at all. Doctors completely panicked. They start jumping out the windows. They're running out the back exits. One doctor climbed inside a chimney to try to hide for a while. These doctors just scattered completely. And the mob overran the hospital. They started taking specimens there in jars and things, started smashing them on the ground. They were taking bodies out, dragging them out the street, dragging them to the graveyard, reburying them, things like that. They started it on fire at one point. Basically, they overran and destroyed this hospital. And as word got around the city about this happening, more and more people started showing up. And once they had trashed this hospital, they started marching to other hospitals. And by that night, so it kind of extended over the night. And by the next morning, they had 5,000 people marching around the city in a big mob going from hospital to hospital. And one hospital they did want to destroy, sort of the biggest, most famous hospital in town, was Columbia University. So they marched on Columbia University. And Alexander Hamilton himself had to stand on the steps of Columbia University and beg them not to destroy the hospital. And the mob did back off of Columbia University. Alexander Hamilton had kind of that common touch, and he got them to back away. But they went to other hospitals and kept doing this over and over. So eventually, the mayor got involved in this riot going on in the city. He called the militia and gathered the militia there, and he rounded up all the doctors he could find, and he threw them into jail. Not to arrest them or anything, but just because the jail was the strongest building in town, and he was trying to protect them. So he put them in the jail to protect them. But eventually, the mob got word that the doctors were in the jail, and they surrounded the jail. And they started rioting there. They were screaming, bring out your doctors. They were throwing stones. They were trying to tear down fences, break windows, things like that. And eventually, the mayor called in a few blue bloods, other politicians, to do what Hamilton had did and try to get them to back off. So one of the politicians they called in was John Jay, for instance, future governor of New York, future Supreme Court justice, etc. But as I said, Jay was a bit of a blue blood, bit of an aristocrat. And these people said, well, what does this guy know about, having his loved one's graves robbed? He's an aristocrat. So someone threw a brick, hit John Jay right in the head, and he crumpled. And he was bleeding from his skull, had a cracked skull after that. And eventually, in all the confusion and the rocks flying and all this stuff, the militia ended up opening fire. No one knows exactly what happened, but the militia ended up opening fire. And at least 7 people died when this happened. And some accounts say up to 20 people died when this happened. So it all started with one body, but it ended with many, many more bodies. And that's a picture of John Jay. And I find this story kind of fascinating for a few reasons. First, it's just such an interesting story. I mean, it has grave robbing, Alexander Hamilton, this kind of tension between these doctors. It's a really fascinating story. And again, this is something I feel like I would have remembered a lot better than Shays' rebellion or whatever. These rebellions I really don't remember a whole lot about. But I also think it's fascinating for the sort of ethical dilemmas it introduces, because I think you could really make a case here for both sides. In that, on the one hand, there were these everyday people. They didn't want their graves robbed. Perfectly understandable thing. You don't want your graves, you don't want your loved ones being stolen and dissected against their will. And this burden fell especially heavily on the poorest parts of society. You were much more likely to have your grave robbed if you were Black or if you were Native American. If you were poor, you were much more likely to have your grave robbed. If you were a German or Irish immigrant, much more likely to have your grave robbed. Sort of the poorer parts of society were much more susceptible to having this happen to them. At the same time, I think you could make a case for the doctors as well. As the doctors, again, were trying to help people. There's no way they could cure these diseases unless they knew what they were doing, unless they learned anatomy, saw how diseases progressed, saw how the body was fitting together. The progress of medicine overall depended on this knowledge, and there was no way they could get it without doing this illegal thing. And one interesting thing, I think, is that or I should back up a little bit, and there was this tension there, and this tension never really went away. It lasted for decades and decades. Because I mentioned the riot in New York, but other anatomy riots took place in Cleveland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, New Haven, just over and over and over. There are at least 16 documented anatomy riots in the US before the Civil War. So this wasn't just one thing happening one time. This happened over and over throughout the country. And believe it or not, we're still dealing with a lot of these tensions today. Bodies are still being stolen. Bodies are still being chopped up, especially internationally. And they're being sold in a lot of cases too, on what they call not the black market, but the red market. And just like way back when, this burden often falls most heavily on poor people, on the poor parts of society, but not exclusively. If you remember Alistair Cook, who hosted Masterpiece Theater, a very famous show for a long time on PBS, Alistair Cook's body was actually stolen after he died and chopped up for parts. So this happens to a lot of different people from all strata of society. So again, these tensions remain with us today. And that's one thing I did strive to do with the book, is show how these stories are still with us today. This story took place in the 1700s, but in a lot of ways, we're still dealing with a lot of these issues. They cast a long shadow, and the sins of science are not all safely buried in its past. So admittedly, that was a bit of a heavy story, but not all of the tales in The Ice Pick Surgeon are so dark. There's one story about piracy that has some rollicking fun in it. I mean, who doesn't like a good pirate story? And there is a section about crimes in the future that's fun in sort of a sci-fi way. How we might use artificial intelligence or something like CRISPR gene editing technology to wreak havoc in ways maybe we haven't even imagined yet. I talk, in fact, about whole new types of crimes in the future that don't exist today based on new technologies that we might get. But probably the best example of sort of a lighthearted dastardly deed in the book is the next story that I'm going to talk about here, switching from medicine over to a bit of paleontology. So a little bit more biology, paleontology. And this story involves these two fellows right here, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. So for some context, they were paleontologists. They studied dinosaur bones, and they got involved in what's now called the Bone Wars. So for a bit of context, in the mid-1800s, when they were working, no one had ever really heard of dinosaurs before. They'd just been discovered not too long before that, and they were just this sort of obscure taxon of lizard. No one really knew what they were, had heard of them, anything like that. It was really Marsh and Cope who made dinosaurs dinosaurs. They made them the famous animals they are today. The first thing any kid wants to see in a museum is they want to see the dinosaurs. And the reason why is because of Marsh and Cope. They're the ones who made them so famous. And Marsh and Cope started off as friends. They were both young American paleontologists. They were in Europe together, happened to be in Europe together at the same time, traveling around to different museums, studying collections, things like that. And they ran across each other then, and they hit it off, became friends. And when they both returned to the United States, they even started naming new species that they had discovered after each other. One named an amphibian after one, and the other returned the favor and named a reptile after the other one. And I think that's kind of sweet. You know, that's how paleontologists show affection. They name species after each other. It's kind of a nice thing. But ultimately, their personalities were just too different to remain friends for very long. Cope there with the mustache. He was kind of a glad-hander, very smooth operator, but he had a horrible temper. And if you crossed him once, you were dead to him. He would hate you after that. So a little vengeful, but very good in other situations, very smooth like that. Marsh was always a bit more awkward, a bit more clumsy. For an example, he wrote a love letter once to a young woman he was trying to woo. And in the letter, he praised her as the prettiest little vertebrate that he had ever seen in his life. He was just always a little clumsy, a little jealous of Cope and how smooth, and Cope always had friends and things. Marsh was always a little jealous of him for that. And again, they were just too different to remain friends. In the 1870s or so, I think it was, Cope was making some amazing discoveries in a quarry pit in New Jersey. So the diggers had been there digging up, I think it was marl or some kind of rock, and they found these bones. They called Cope in. He dug them out, and he discovered the first substantial dinosaur bones in North America. This is a duck-billed dinosaur here, and this was a spectacular discovery. I think it was the first time they'd been discovered outside of Europe, actually. So amazing discovery, very complete, full skeleton, and it wowed people. It was a giant discovery. And Marsh, frankly, got very jealous of this. His friend Cope was making these big headlines, making a big splash. He wanted to be the one doing this. He didn't want his friend to do this. So he went to visit Cope in this quarry up in New Jersey. And he got there and he was all, smiling, congratulating him, shaking his hands, etc. He got a tour of the quarry. He said, "Oh, thank you very much, but I need to go back and catch my train back north now." And he started walking down the block. Then he turned right back around, went to the quarry, found the foreman of the quarry, got out a big wad of cash, and he said, "Any more dinosaur bones you find in this quarry, they are coming to me from now on. You are cutting my friend out. They are coming to me." So he bribed the owner of the quarry to get these bones for him. Well, eventually, Cope found out about this. Again, the temper came up, and he was furious about this. And this is how their feud got started. When Marsh backstabbed Cope and Cope got mad, they would start doing things like combing over each other's papers word by word, pointing out every little mistake in it and saying, this guy's an idiot. Look at all these mistakes he's made. The feud started to escalate. And it got really, really nasty when their feud shifted out to the western part of the US, because they were both based on the East Coast at the time. And it's actually kind of hard for us to imagine the fossil bonanza that was the American West at the time, from western South Dakota out to about Utah and Nevada over there. In many cases, there were just giant dinosaur bones lying on the ground. You could just walk on a trail and find giant dinosaur bones just lying there on the ground. There's actually a story of a shepherd in Wyoming who built essentially a log cabin out of dinosaur bones and was living in it because there were so many giant bones just lying around that you could do whatever you wanted with. And as word of this trickled back to the East Coast, Marsh and Cope they both said, "We have to get there. When there's a bonanza out there, we are going there." And they ended up in kind of the same spots because a newspaper story would talk about the bones and they would just kind of travel around from spot to spot. And when their teams got there, you can see, I think it's Marsh's team here. When the teams got there, they would kind of be circling each other, kind of like gangs at a playground, watching each other, eyeing each other. And things got pretty nasty. One group would maybe sneak up on a bluff behind the other group and start throwing stones down at them, pushing rocks off to try to scatter them. Other times, they would sneak into camps and they would steal bones from each other. Or they would dress up as a traveling salesman, put a fake mustache and a funny hat on and say, "Oh, I'm here to sell some goods," and go around and spy on the other bones that they have. In at least one case, the groups pulled guns on each other. One team eventually filled up the wagons that they had. There were no more bones they could put on there. There were still some bones lying in the site. And rather than let their rivals get them, they decided to dynamite the bones, just blew them to smithereens, just so their rivals would not get these bones. So you had a full-on war between these groups of scientists. But here's the thing I really find interesting about this story is that, this rivalry was pretty darn heated and got pretty petty at times. But it also ended up benefiting science overall. Aside from a few blown up bones here and there, because each team had its rivals, they ended up pushing themselves much harder than they would have had they not had the rivals out there. They worked a lot harder. They worked earlier in the season to later in the season. They worked longer hours. They ranged farther afield to find more bones. They ended up working a lot harder because they had that rival, because they had a rival always pushing them. And these were truly the most spectacular skeletons that anyone in history had ever seen. Between them, Marsh and Cope discovered so many iconic species of dinosaurs. Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, or what we now call Apatosaurus. They discovered all of these iconic dinosaurs. And as I mentioned, no one really knew what dinosaurs were before this point. Cope and Marsh are the ones who made them some of the most famous animals of all time. And I admit, I kind of find this hilarious in a sophomoric way. These very learned scientists going around sabotaging each other, spying and doing all that sort of stuff. But it's a good reminder of what rivalries can do. They really can push us to do things bigger and better than we would have without them. And it's also a good reminder that not all of these stories of scientific misdeeds are dark. There is some fun mischief around as well. And the final story I'm going to talk about tonight actually involves the title story for this book, The So-Called Ice Pick Surgeon. It's a bit of a strange case because it involves someone who did sin grievously, and he did so partly because of ambition, but partly too because he wanted to help his patients too much. And that person is this man right here, Dr. Walter Freeman, who perfected an operation known as the lobotomy. And in doing this, he became probably the most reviled doctor in American history, and one of the most reviled doctors in all of history, maybe second only to Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor of World War II. So Freeman started off in medicine in the 1930s in Washington, D.C. And for a while there, he was leading kind of a double life. There were two parts of his life. One part of his life, he was a teacher at George Washington University in D.C. And by all accounts, he was an absolutely mesmerizing, electrifying teacher. Students loved him uniformly. He would stroll into class with his diamond-tipped cane. He had a giant funny hat on his head. He would walk in, start cracking jokes. He had everyone's attention immediately. And he had all these jokes again, and he had these little tricks he would do to get students' attention and to keep their attention. So one thing he could do, he could take a piece of chalk in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other hand, and he could simultaneously draw two different anatomical structures on the board at the same time using one hand and the other hand. It was like a circus performer up there. He would just pull out trick after trick after trick to keep their attention. And again, students loved this guy. Because he was kind of new on the faculty, he had to teach classes often on early mornings on Saturday. So, like 8:30 a.m. No one wanted to be in this class 8:30 on a Saturday morning. But his classes were always packed because the students loved him so much. And these medical students would actually bring their girlfriends and boyfriends along to the class because he was so entertaining. They said it was better than going to the movies being in this class with Walter Freeman. So this was the part of his life that he loved. The bad side was his other job because he also worked at an insane asylum. And especially at the time, insane asylums were truly dismal places. They were simply awful. Mostly because doctors had no way to treat the worst patients. If you were psychotic, if you were seeing visions, if you'd had a break with reality, doctors had zero drugs. They had zero treatments for you. There was nothing they could do. In a lot of cases, all they could do was just wrap you in a straitjacket, put you in a padded cell, and just try to plug their ears because you'd be making noise, you'd be screaming, something like that. There was nothing they could do. A lot of these people couldn't have furniture in their room because they would smash it. They would impale themselves. They would attack other people with it. Some of them couldn't have clothes even. They would tear them up. They would soil themselves over and over. So they couldn't even have clothes. And they certainly couldn't interact with other people. So all that doctors could do was lock them in these rooms and let them sit there day after day, year after year after year. And people like Walter Freeman were appalled by this. They saw all this wasted life, all this wasted human potential because there was nothing they could do. It gnawed at him. He wanted to help these people very, very badly. And then, like a bolt from the blue, came what he thought was going to be his salvation. A doctor in Portugal developed a procedure that became known as the lobotomy. And the basic idea of the lobotomy was fairly simple. So in the front of our brains, we have basically, they call the frontal lobes. They're the reasoning centers of our brains. So they deal with things like planning, executing plans, reasoning, things like that. Most of that happens in the frontal part of our brain, simplifying a little bit, but that's the basic idea. Then deeper inside the brain, there's what's called the limbic system, which is involved in emotions and emotional processing. And the basic idea at the time was that when the limbic system, when the emotional center, I should back up and say the idea at the time was that mental illness was caused when the emotional centers of the brain got too revved up, and they got so revved up that they overwhelmed the reasoning centers of the brain and basically shut them down. So the idea with the lobotomy was, well, if you can sever the connections between the emotional centers and the reasoning centers of the brain, if you can cut those connections, then the reasoning centers can kind of take over, they won't get overwhelmed, and they can calm the person down. And in the original lobotomies, what they would do is they would open up about a dime or nickel-sized wafer in the brain, one on each side, and they would put a stiletto down there and they would kind of swish it around to, again, disconnect the connections between the emotional centers and the frontal lobe in the brain. And nowadays, we know that that is too simplistic. I talk about this more in the book, but you can't just sever the connections and do that. That's not going to fix the problem. But there are cases where people's emotions are revving out of control. That can happen. And when doctors tried lobotomies as a last resort in these most desperate cases, when there was no other treatment to try, it did sometimes calm people down afterwards. They stopped screaming. They stopped being psychotic. It did calm them down somewhat. Now, to be clear, the lobotomy did not cure them by any stretch. All it did was basically calm them down. But they weren't as tortured anymore. They could do simple human things like go outside for a little bit and feel some sunshine on their face. They could sit down and have a meal with another person. So in these most desperate cases, as a last resort, lobotomies were actually defensible at first in the 1930s and early 1940s. But the problem was Walter Freeman was a little too ambitious. And Walter Freeman was not content to let lobotomies be a last resort. He wanted them to be the first line of defense against mental illness. And the reason why, and they actually decided he wanted to change lobotomies. He wanted to change how they got done. And the reason why was fairly simple. In that, again, I mentioned you had to, for the original lobotomies, you had to open up a hole on one side of the skull, open up a hole on the other side of the skull. You needed an anesthesiologist there. You needed a neurosurgeon there. The person had to go under. There was a long recovery process, a very laborious procedure. It was also very slow. You can't just do these over and over. You need all these people there. It takes a long time to do this procedure. Well, Walter Freeman said there are 1 million people in asylums in the United States alone. We can't do this long, laborious procedure. We need to find a shortcut. So he started looking for one. And one day in his kitchen, he found the shortcut he was looking for. He opened up a drawer and he saw an ice pick in there. And he picked it up and he said, "This is the perfect tool for neurosurgery. I know exactly what to do with this." And if you're a little squeamish, you might want to look away from this next slide. It won't be up there long, but this is what Freeman decided he could do with this ice pick. He realized he could access the brain another way. Instead of going through the top where the skull is relatively thick, he could go in through the eye sockets, the corner of the eye, because the bone behind the eye is relatively thin. So you could take the ice pick, slide it in there, crack through that bone, and then access the connections he was trying to sever from a different angle. That was basically the idea. Now, to be clear, Freeman did not use the ice pick his whole career. He later developed other tools to do this. But during his first few surgeries in Washington, D.C., he really did use that ice pick from his kitchen drawer. What he would do is he had an office with another doctor in it, and he had to sneak the patients in the back door and upstairs to his office. because he knew the other doctor would have rightly thrown a fit that he was trying to do experimental neurosurgery upstairs in his unsterile office. So he was sneaking patients up there, doing this surgery on them, and he decided, okay, I like the results, I like what I'm seeing, so I'm going to take this to the rest of the country. So what he started doing is he started doing these summer road trips where he would get in his car and he would drive around, usually to rural states, just going from asylum to asylum and doing these operations, doing these frontal lobotomies on different people year after year after year. And actually, the very first place he went, besides the ones he did in DC, the very first place he did them outside of DC was here in South Dakota. He did them down at Yankton at the asylum down there because he knew the director of the asylum. So that's where he did his first ones outside of DC, was down in Yankton. And Freeman had a bit of a crass sense of humor. He called these trips his headhunting expeditions. And he had kind of the same routine every single day. He would wake up at a campground, usually stayed at campgrounds, and he was a barbiturate addict. He could not get to sleep at night without taking several barbiturates. So he would kind of shake off his drug hangover from the night before, get in his car, he would drive to the next asylum on his agenda. He would get there, he would give a talk, they would have lunch, etc. And then after lunch, the show would start. And Walter Freeman always made sure that it was a show. He would line up a dozen of the asylum patients that were going to get the lobotomies. He would invite in all the reporters, invite in photographers, et cetera, so everyone can see what he was doing. You can see an example here. This is an actual operation that Walter Freeman's performing. And in the time of COVID, one thing pops out immediately about this operation in Walter Freeman. And what is that? He is not wearing a mask, and he is not wearing any gloves either as he is doing this procedure. Freeman didn't believe in what he called all that germ crap. He didn't believe in that, decided he could do a better job without a mask and gloves on. And he loved the show, and he was kind of cracking wise to the reporters the whole time. And he had these tricks he would do during the lobotomies as well. So remember I said he could take a piece of chalk in one hand, piece of chalk in the other hand, he could draw two things simultaneously. He also developed a way to put a stiletto in one hand and a stiletto in the other hand. He could do two lobotomies simultaneously, show off for the reporters, show off for the photographers while he was doing this. If someone passed out, he would make a joke that said, I've made more people swoon than Frank Sinatra. Everyone would laugh, the reporters would write it down. He loved putting on a show during these procedures. Freeman's most famous case actually involved the Kennedy family. You might know that President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, had a sister named Rosemary, who had kind of a harrowing birth. This is another story from the era that's sort of unbelievable today, but the mother started going into labor, and there was a midwife there. But the midwife decided they'd better wait for the doctor to get there. So the mother was giving birth, the baby was coming out. The midwife decided to push the baby back inside the mother. And unfortunately, the umbilical cord got wrapped around the neck and she lost oxygen. The baby Rosemary lost oxygen to her brain for a few minutes. Ended up having some brain damage. You can see Rosemary here. She is on the right. But beyond this mild brain damage, she grew up fairly healthy. She had a little trouble learning how to ride a bike, a bit slow to speak, maybe a little clumsy with the utensils, things like that. But she was fairly high-spirited, fairly normal, even if a little slow, but, had a fairly decent life. But to Joseph Kennedy, the father, she was an embarrassment. He had to have an absolute perfect family. He could not have someone who was a little slow in his family, could not have someone who was a little clumsy in his family. So he decided to kind of get Rosemary out of the picture, and he locked her in a convent with a bunch of nuns as a teenager and said, they can deal with her. Well, Rosemary didn't like this. She started sneaking out at night, going and seeing friends, things like that. And Joseph decided this was unacceptable. So he called up Walter Freeman, and he had Walter Freeman, his partner, actually perform a lobotomy on Rosemary. And it was frankly a disaster from the start. Again, Rosemary was very high-spirited before, but afterwards she sort of fell into this shell of herself. She lost control of her bodily functions for a long time. She couldn't speak. She couldn't walk. And eventually she did recover some of these abilities after a long, laborious rehab procedure. But again, she lost that high spiritedness. She was just sort of there. She lost her spark, her initiative. You could kind of get her to do something. You'd say, "Hey, Rosemary, want to take a walk?" And she'd say, "Okay, sure." And just kind of walk with you. And then she would go back and just kind of sit there and not do anything. She never did anything on her own. She had no spark, no initiative. And reportedly, Joseph Kennedy was furious about the results of this procedure, but he ended up getting what he wanted. He got control of his daughter. But failures like this did not stop Walter Freeman. He had this vision. He wanted to help people. He wanted to cure them. So he kept making these lobotomy road trips year after year after year, summer after summer. He once ended up, he would try to outdo himself sometimes. His record was 25 lobotomies that he did in a single day one time. And he did them mostly on women because women ended up in asylums at higher rates than men did. So most of his patients were women, and most of them were adult women. But he did children sometimes as well. Did children as young as 6, 7 years old sometimes. He would give these children lobotomies. And overall, Freeman did 4,000 lobotomies by himself from coast to coast. And his disciples did tens of thousands of more of them around the world. And in the book, I explain a little bit more about what finally led to Walter Freeman's downfall. But for a while, he was the most famous doctor in the United States, the doctor who had brought lobotomies to the masses. And Freeman loved being known as this person. He once called himself the Henry Ford of lobotomies because he had brought them to the people. He loved that name, the Henry Ford of lobotomies. And I can't help myself. I find him such a fascinating, interesting character because, again, he really did want to help people. He wanted to get them out of these crowded, dirty, filthy asylums. He really had the best of intentions. But we all know what the road to hell is paved with. And I think this brings up a tough question because I would argue that for all of the damage that he did, Walter Freeman wasn't sadistic. I don't think he was a monster. I think it's too easy to dismiss him as that. But it does beg the question of how can we prevent atrocities like this in the future? And I think it goes back to that Einstein quote. Most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character. And over the last century, especially, science has gained a lot of power in our society. And sometimes this comes from really obvious things like atomic bombs. But science is also gaining a lot of power in other ways, things like medicine, psychology, these interactions, interpersonal interactions with everyday people. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that science is not just a way to discover new things. It is broader than that. It's part of our society, a vital part of our society. It's not just about spin-off technologies and stuff like that. And I think character is vital for wielding the power of science properly. And overall, that's what this book, The Ice Pick Surgeon, is trying to do. There are stories about Cleopatra, Thomas Edison, stuff like that. Starts in the ancient past, goes to the future. But above all, it's a book of stories about scientists who went rogue and why they went rogue, how exactly they broke bad, what motivated them. I talk about blind spots among scientists, the type of psychological defenses they employ in order to justify their actions. I do include some tips and tricks for trying to make sure that science is more ethical in the future. And I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea because I love science. I think humanity is much better off for the science that we have. And not just materially and technologically, but even spiritually as well. I think about all the wonders about the cosmos that science has revealed to us. But I also know that science can do better. And so I hope the gut punch of some of these stories can do a little bit to help make science better in the future. So again, thank you everyone for joining me this evening. I appreciate it. And I think we have time for questions if anyone has anything they want to ask.
Were there any legal ramifications of Freeman's activities?
I can repeat the question if people online. Were there legal ramifications of Freeman's activities? Not really. He never ended up getting in trouble with the law, anything like that. By the end of his career, he did end up losing surgical privileges in the few places that would still let him operate, in a few hospitals on the West Coast, actually, that would let him operate. He ended up killing a lot of patients, sadly. He would nick arteries and things, and it just happened one too many times. They revoked his operating privileges at the hospital. But no, beyond that, there really wasn't anything that happened to him. So, I think in the picture, yeah.
Can you share what you're working on next?
I can, yes. He asked what I'm working on next. I am doing a new book now about archaeology. In particular, a field called experimental archaeology. So instead of archaeologists going out and kind of brushing off things in the dirt and trying to figure out a society or something, the experimental archaeologists are actually making things. So they'll maybe find some bread in King Tut's tomb or something, and they'll wonder, well, what did it taste like? Instead of just looking at it and guessing, we can go out, we can find the grains that they had back then. We know what kind of pots they used. We can build the ovens that they did, and we grind it on stone. We can make this bread again, see what King Tut might have actually eaten, something like that. I've gone around ancient ships. They would have sailed around to different islands in Polynesia. People still do this kind of thing. I went to an authentic Roman feast in England a couple months ago. So it's just these people doing these really kind of strange, sometimes, experiments, trying to recreate the past in different ways and learn about things. Learn about the past, kind of bring it alive in a more sensory-rich capacity than before. So that's what I'm working on with you. And then,
how did you decide? Excuse me. How did you decide what to put in the book?
the ice pick surgeon. She asked how I decided what to put in and what to omit from the book. I wanted a wide range of stories from a lot of different fields. I focused a little bit more on medicine tonight, but I wanted some physics stories, some paleontology, some botany, different areas. And I wanted a good time coverage too. But most of all, I was just frankly looking for stories that captivated me, stories I thought were interesting. I did, cover things like the Nazi doctors in World War II. That story's been told, I think, enough where I didn't want to devote a whole chapter to it. But I wanted to uncover some new and interesting stories as well. And just kind of looking for variety, different things. But mostly, and I do this in all my books, just trying to find the stories that captivated me, that I found the most interesting and that had something illustrative about them, or there was something really compelling about the human beings involved, the victims involved, or the scientists involved, things like that.
And how did you go about collecting the stories? Like, where did you look for them? Where did you do the research?
I'd actually had this idea in mind for quite a while to do something about science and crime. And so I read very widely, and I'm always kind of looking for ideas and kind of picking things out and just kind of plucking them. And I had a file in my folder, a file on my computer, where I would just copy and paste things that I had found. So, I probably from different books I'd read, from scientific journals, magazine articles, talking to people. People say, I mentioned what I was working on. They say, have you heard about this terrible scientist who had done something? So just kind of being a magpie and just grabbing whatever I could from a lot of different places. Most probably either came from history journals or snippets in books that I had read where they just mentioned it, and I thought, I've got to know more about that. So kind of a variety of sources.
At what point does your nonfiction have to develop some dialogue and personality that goes beyond what factually you fill in the gaps?
Yeah, he asked it with nonfiction, when can you fill things in and go beyond, include dialogue, things like that. I don't know if there was any dialogue in the book, unless I was quoting from something. I think you have a little bit of leeway and you can be a little, use your imagination, clearly. As long as you're clear with the reader about what you're inventing or where you're doing something. You can say, we don't know what they had for dinner tonight, but based on bubble, we can imagine, stuff like that. I think more with nonfiction, the creativity comes in how you frame the story what you include, what you exclude, where you start, where you end, and how you go from A to B. I think that's where most of the creativity comes in. And I think it can be an interesting trope of introducing things you've imagined, but you don't want to do that too much, I don't think, and only in crucial spots. And I think, again, more of the creativity is how you frame it, what to include and exclude, things like that. Any other? Yeah.
Who are some of the authors that inspired you to write?
Well, it's kind of changed over the year. I mean, when I was a kid, I did read a lot. My favorite books were the Childcraft encyclopedias. If anyone remembers those, anyone? Yeah, a few. Okay, getting some blank stares and some happy nods here. Those were fun. Authors that inspired me. I think about just authors I like reading nowadays. People like Carl Zimmer's written a lot of great books. Deborah Bloom, Amy Stewart, David Quammen's written some great books. One of my favorite books is The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's a big, thick doorstop, but it's a fantastic book. But I do try to read really widely. I read a lot of fiction too, because you can learn a lot about how to reveal character very quickly, learn a lot about atmosphere, things like that from reading fiction. So I try to read as widely as I can and just always keep my eye out for different things that I can use and pick up. Yeah.
You had to spend a lot of time reading about terrible atrocities.
I did, yes.
When you were writing, and I guess as you finished writing, did you find yourself more hopeful or more cynical about human science or human nature and medicine and science and all these fields?
Yeah, he asked if I had to read a lot of horrible things about horrible deeds, and whether at the end of that I ended up more cynical or more hopeful. I felt like if you read history and write about history, you're a bit cynical in the first. It just kind of comes with the territory in some ways. And it was hard to read a lot of these stories, but the overall goal of the book was to try to get science to a place where it could do better. So I think that having that goal in mind did help. And I do think we are in a better spot than we were even something like 50 years ago, and definitely more than a century ago, because we do have these safeguards in place. You have things like IRB boards, and you have even scientists themselves much more aware of the bad thing, how you can abuse the power that you have, and why you need to take ethics into account the entire time. So CRISPR, for instance, the gene editing technology, you have people like Jennifer Doudna, who Nobel Prize winner, talking about the ethics of it, putting that at the center of what she's doing, and other people doing the exact same thing. So I do think there's more of a sense nowadays of scientists not just discovering things and playing with their new toys and gadgets. They think about the ramifications more. So, and it won't stop everything, but I'm encouraged by that development. So I can also go. There's a survey, right?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm not cutting it off, but I'm just saying, this is coming up there. But happy to take any more questions if anyone has any, or I will be out there signing books if you're feeling shy or you think of something. So yeah.
How did you become interested in becoming a writer?
It was a bit of a roundabout path how I became interested in becoming a writer. It was a bit of a roundabout path because I went to college totally focused on becoming a scientist. I was at the U of M, Minnesota. I was a physics major, was totally focused on, took all the physics, chemistry, biology classes I could. Then got about 3 years into it and things kind of swerved on me because I realized that I didn't like being in labs at all. I was clumsy. I found it very tedious and frustrating. I did not enjoy it. And it was a bit of a scary moment because I had been focused on being a scientist for so long, all through high school. Even before that, I was going to be a scientist. I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore almost if I wasn't going to be a scientist. And I ended up kind of panicking a little bit, ran to the other side of campus, getting an English major. So I got an English major at the same time, kind of working both. And I decided to become a writer because I'd always really enjoyed writing. I enjoyed, reading novels and plays and poems and things like that. And I decided I could do writing and I could kind of combine the two. and that it would be fascinating. It would be interesting. I would get to learn about the science that I love without having to be stuck in the lab and having to actually do the science. But I did come to writing fairly late. I was, 21 or 22, something like that. I never wrote a novel when I was 5 that my parents can pull out or anything like that. So came to it kind of late. Okay. Do one more if anyone has it, or we could.
Yeah, thanks for pulling up the survey. Please, if you're not into doing this on pen and paper, get the QR code. We would love to know what you think about this program, and we would love to incorporate your feedback as we continue to improve this program. Good spaces. I have one question, if you don't mind.
Okay, no.
Where's your favorite library where you live?
Where I live? Oh, I mean, I'm in DC, so it has to be the Library of Congress. It's a pretty obvious answer.
Safe
But
answer, yeah. Well, let's thank Sam Kean.
We have a raffle. We're gonna pull out 3 names and you will each get a book to take home. And then you are free to go. Please take more food. Visit the table over there and leave us your name, fill out an evaluation. But thank you all very much for coming.
It is time.
Buy a book and get a sign. Yeah.
Oh, apparently I'm. Cool. I won't pick my own name on the side.
3 times.
So we're gonna pick for 3 books. This is, and we're doing this in order. We're gonna pick for Sam's book first. Okay. Tiffany Johnson. There you go.